Welcome, and thank you for joining us for another live episode of Teachers for Teachers. That's you, moms and dads. I'm Dr. Dejana, and I'm here with Dr. Leah.
Hello, welcome. And we're continuing a conversation that we started last week about equity and how to raise children that are sensitive culturally and empathetic.
Absolutely. And we really want to revisit this because this is super important when it comes to the education of young people.
It is, and it was very important to us as we started this conversation about helping parents embrace the change and to use it to really motivate their education and their commitment to their children's education and the children's commitment to their education.
Absolutely. It goes to the core of why we're here. Like, why do we show up on all of these days to have a conversation with all of you about these topics? It's so important. It all comes back down to the children and the education of the children and how we can support creative and playful learning opportunities for all.
Yes. So, should we introduce our panel today? Because I think we could dive right into this.
I think this is a dive in for sure. This is a dive in, absolutely. So, we want to welcome our amazing panel, team of experts. First of all, I'd like to bring your attention to Dr. Marcella Klein Williams. Go ahead and say hello, Marcella. Marcella. Awesome. We're so glad she's here. An accomplished leader, William's strengths include organizational development, systems design, and strategic partnerships. She's led an impressive career in teaching and administration within the P20, that's preschool through graduate level education. Chief Education Officer for the California STEM Learning Network and the Director of Special Projects for Somas Union School District. Most recently, the co-founder and principal lead for Solve for Pattern, an educational consulting firm that links STEM teaching, learning, and employment. Welcome again to Dr. Marcella Klein Williams. So happy to have you. Also joining us is Anne McMullen. Again, so happy to have Anne. Anne McMullen is an education consultant based in Los Angeles. She works throughout the entire United States and internationally as a public speaker, writer, and consultant with a focus on leadership. She's currently the project director for COSIN Empowered Superintendents Program and the author of Life Lessons in Leadership. Welcome, and go ahead and say hello. We're so happy to have them.
Thank you. Well, Anne, I think you're a good place to start with this conversation because you've been involved in tech and in schools, and that is really kind of the great divide right now for families that have 3 or 4 children and not necessarily 3 or 4 devices and trying to do this distance learning. What can you tell us?
Twofold. It is devices, as you mentioned. Well, it's actually more than twofold. It's devices, but it's also basic access. And for the last 20 years, the Federal Communications Commission has been dealing with the problem and trying to solve the issue of internet access in schools. And in fact, this program has taken on a nickname of the homework gap because when children do not have access at home and they're getting homework to be done at home, that's an issue. And many districts, as far back as 20 years ago, started the process of distributing devices to kids. But there's a real problem with the access issue. And there have been some highly creative things to try to solve that, but the issue is not solved. And one of the things that's going on now in both the Senate and the House, there are bills in place to look at. There's a program called E-rate that the FCC runs, which provides funding for internet access to schools. Well, now that school is not just in a school building, they are looking at how can they use that E-rate money to provide access at home. So that's one of the things that they are beginning to take a look at. The fact is that 1 in 3 households do not have broadband access. And that's a real crisis for our kids, particularly right now, when with this whole remote learning push, they had to move that. So we can talk more about that. As you would expect, the places where that happens the most is in high need, low income communities. And also rural communities are struggling with this. So it's something we really have to address. I've worked with a number of districts who are looking at different ways to do that. I'll wrap this up just real quick at this part. Working with a district actually in Southern California near San Diego, they were a very progressive district and they thought they had this thing covered and everybody had devices and children were using those devices. But what the pandemic taught them is that the students who were using the devices outside of school were actually going to places like McDonald's or somewhere else to get their internet access, or sitting in the parking lot of the school building. Right. And so now they realize that the access is more of an issue. And schools have done things like put Wi-Fi on buses and distribute hotspots, and we can talk more about that. But the fact is, this issue of access has been called a civil rights issue of our time, because if you look at it, it is about school, but today it's about healthcare, it's about jobs, it's, you know, it's so broad, and I'm so glad we're tackling this today. Thank you.
Point about that accessibility. I mean, equity is a big term in education right now. It's a buzzword, and many people think equity equals equality. All children get to go to school. It's equal, but it's not the same. I think what happens is when we focus on equity, equity can create equality by prioritizing the resources and getting those resources to the students that need them the most. So it's all about that accessibility piece. Like, how do we get every student what they need?
And I think, Marcella, you've had some experience in your community with lack of access. I mean, Anne mentioned rural being an issue. I grew up on a farm, and my niece and nephew who live on the farm now don't have internet access.
Yeah, definitely is where I serve now as a STEM director. It's in a community that's underrepresented communities and high poverty as well. One of the things that came up with the pandemic is one of the internet providers was providing internet access, but they didn't do it for that high need zip code. Isn't that crazy? Oh. So it's like, yes, you can have free access, but not if you're in that zip code. And then one of the pieces that it was percolating as well is within a home, how many people are sharing one device as opposed to everybody has their own. So if everybody's trying to engage in schooling at the same time, then it's just not enough to have one device if you have 3 different kids trying to log into their classes and have opportunities to really engage with the learning. And one of the things I think about is nobody would ever say it's okay if we don't provide water to some homes, but we do provide water to other homes. Well, this is a fountain of knowledge. So you have to provide it to everybody. And especially the investment that we make in education, it's not altruistic at all. There's a reason we pay tax dollars, is because there's, you know, such a return on that investment that we're giving. So the last thing we want to do is have, you know, devices or, you know, more importantly, what I see impacting our community is exactly what you're saying. Those hotspots is where can they go to be able to access reliable internet, to be able to do their homework. And then in a college setting, what we're often finding is the students were making do with internet access by using their phones. And there is a limitation as to how much you can actually do on a phone. So I think people would be surprised in a community such that I serve, how many adults who are college students don't have even a Chromebook, an inexpensive laptop of their very own to be able to use. Yeah, so this is a huge need, and exactly what you're saying, Dr. Dejana. This has everything to do with equity. Is what is it that people need to be able to really engage in learning? Because that's what we're trying to do in educational settings. What do they need in order to get engaged in the learning?
I'd be really interested in hearing from both of you, because you're both working with superintendents and the higher level admin. What are we thinking for this next year? I mean, all day today it's been about schools have to open this fall and the president's been pushing. But are the parents ready to send the kids there? Is it safe? And what are they talking about at the superintendent level?
Go ahead, Marcella, I'll follow.
Oh, I was just, it turned out I was delivering equipment to 3 different secondary schools. So I interacted with 3 different administrators. So one of them at the last high school that I went to, he said, out of the student body that I have here, and he probably has 2,000 students at that high school, you have 10 to 15% where it's just going to be an uphill battle to engage them, to find them, and to get them to connect in. And then you have 20% of the students where the parents are simply not going to send their students on campus for anything, just for fear. Right now at this moment in history, all we're hearing about is these terrible increases. And then you have 25% where it's like, take my kids, here, have them back. And, he's just pulling these numbers out. And, when we get to the place of really starting school, how we ended our conversation is I shared with him what we did with our OC STEM team is all we have to do is try. There's no guidebook for doing this. But all of us just have to keep trying, because there's not going to be anything perfect. And the one thing that I do have to say when we're talking about what is it that the students need, there was a moment today when we were delivering kits to another school, and a minivan pulled up, and a young girl, a teenage girl, leaned out the window and kind of looked at me and said, can you help me? I was sure. And I see her mom in there, and she says, do you have food? It's like, that was a moment of, we are just walking through history. So Food Share was giving out foods. There were lines that were snaked through parking lots to be able to create that line. And these are proud people. So one of the things that I think, at the institution that I work at, we've got to get better at, because we're asking students who are proud young adults, what do you need? As opposed to, here's what we can offer to every student. Because that's a different question. Mm-hmm. Is nobody likes to be in the position that so many of our families are in right now, that those basic needs, they do have to look for where they can pick up food. So a lot of them, if you say, what do you need? They're like, well, we've got one, we'll share, as opposed to, here's what we have, right. What would you like? So tough.
A lot to consider.
It is a lot to consider. You touched on a point that I think we should definitely bring up. We started this conversation talking about equity and access to technology. But in order for a student to learn, there are a lot of needs that are not being met right now. Access to food, health and wellness, access to shelter. There's so many things. You guys work in this field, we're all educators. What are some suggestions? What are some tools? What are some strategies that we can put in act or start discussing, trying to iterate? Because we're not going to have a perfect solution, right? We have to iterate to address these highlighted issues of equity that are just showing up in a really real way right now during the pandemic.
Not meaning to be Pollyanna about this, but I do think thank goodness we're seeing it finally. You know, this wasn't a problem that just arrived. It's been a problem, but now we're seeing it and we're having to address it. To Marcella's point, I recall that when school districts back in March were very quickly taking the laptops that were in their classrooms and dispersing them for kids to use at home, those disbursement places quickly became food disbursement also. So it wasn't just the technology, it was just to Marcella's point, it was recognizing that food was an issue, and they were providing that to school districts were providing that food to their students and their families in their district. Couple of things I want to address Leah's question about what superintendents are thinking about opening school. It is interesting to hear what people want them to do and what is feasible. What I see many of them is coming up actually with 3 different plans, you know, full scale back, maybe a split hybrid sort of thing, you know, where half the kids come Monday, Wednesday, the other half come Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday is a planning day. And on those opposite days, they're doing remote. You know, one of the issues besides the technology piece is just physically getting students to school. And if we have to do safe distancing on a bus, I had one superintendent tell me he's in a district of 7,000 students in another state. It would take him 24 hours just to get the students to school with, you know, the buses and the distancing and so forth. So there are practical things. There is no question everybody would like all the students back in school. Teachers want them back, kids want to be back. There is no question about that. But it's interesting, Leah, just today before I logged on with you, I saw a news report coming out from Los Angeles. Health officials suggested that all school districts in Los Angeles County should have a plan B around reopening this fall in case there's a spike, which that plan B is going to be go back to remote learning, which brings us back to kind of where we started this conversation. It's not going to go away. And to your point, Dejana, one of the groups you mentioned that I work with, COSN, the Consortium for School Networking, and they have a 1-page document called Creating Equitable Opportunities for All Learners. And just very quickly, I'll give you the highlights. One is to create a common vision, and that's kind of the conversation that we're having, and we need to bring the community together, which is the second one. Convene your community for action. And that means bringing in, as Marcella mentioned, bringing in the internet service providers, have that conversation with them, have them involved in how this is going to happen, as well as hardware and software. And you have to get creative around Wi-Fi deployment and how that's going to work. Libraries have played a critical role in this process, and many times people can check out hotspots from libraries and use them at home. The other piece is to remember that at this point in time, everybody needs to be a digital learner. That means teachers, that means parents, that means all of us have to know how to learn in this environment, and it's different. And that requires a lot of PD for teachers, especially professional development, because teaching in this way is very different than being in a classroom with 25 students. And then learn from others how they're managing it.
Yeah, I think, so here's another thought that I have with this is that what's really needed is innovation, right? And then we know that creativity often kind of bubbles up to the top when we feel safe and we feel engaged and we feel connected. And that's all the things that this pandemic is really kind of ripping apart, right? We feel less engaged, we feel less connected, we definitely feel less safe. So one of the projects that we're working on at the college that I work at is how do we have professional learning support for the staff and educators, because they're the ones who are just like I was today. You know, I could feel my feet turn to cement looking at this young girl asking, do you have food, right? And that's what we're going to be doing over and over again for this next year. So how do we get smart about supporting the staff, the educators, because if they feel supported and they feel safe, then that sense of creativity and play and innovation can really be put to use, because that's what we need, right? There's no binder. And just what I had said to the principal is every day we just have to gather together, we have to try. So that's one of the things that we're trying is how do we put professional learning where they're going to meet weekly or every other week with a group together so that they can learn to be supportive of each other and share their stories, so there is a place to go with that. Because I think if you have pain that's not processed, it becomes something that shoots out in one way or another that you don't have any control over. So yeah.
You know, Marcella,
Is there's been an explosion and we're trying to put all the pieces back in the same places. And maybe it's time to just step back and say, that was the old way.
Yeah.
What is a new way?
no, that's very true, Lee. Some of the school leaders I've heard say, we don't talk about going back to school. We're going forward to school, and that's different. And to Marcella's point about all the different groups that need that support and that training, the other group, which is why I love the whole title of this particular series, parents are
Right.
now involved in a way that they never have been before. And if anything, looking back on those early days in March when we went from, March 13th in school, March 16th remote,
For 2 weeks.
it was the parents that we didn't bring along, that we didn't have the time or the thought process to do that. But that's definitely got to be part of it. And Marcella mentioned earlier, I mean, if you've got 3 kids at home and they're all having to access, and oh, by the way, both parents are working from home also. So how do you navigate all that time and help them?
Yeah, and this question about going back to school, in order to get the economy going, we need a place for those children to be so parents can work. But if we send them back into groups right now, especially in the geographies where there are spikes like here, we're just asking for another major problem down the road.
Well, and there are those who've said, and I think this was true until about a week ago, that young people were not getting COVID, but it does seem that they are now more so, But the fact is that children don't go to school in isolation. So there are teachers there and there are adults there, and the average age is around 50, and they're concerned about going back in that environment, So again, I go back to everybody wants it to happen. We really
Yeah.
do.
Yeah.
But oh my goodness, there's just so much to balance there.
It's a lot. It's a lot. I mean, as an educator, as a parent, it's a lot. I like to refer to going back to school as going back to learning. And this is an opportunity for us to be really innovative in deciding what that looks like. We're going to go back to learn, and it's going to be completely different and completely new. Because we have to make, I understand that administrators have to make decisions, and their decisions are going to be based on science and data. But this isn't only science and data, this is a sociology experiment as well. Like Leah said, where do the children go? And wherever they are, we want them learning. And that's one of the things that I think brings us full circle to why we're doing this. And at 2-Bit Circus Foundation, our core is that learning is everywhere. So let's build a community, a supportive community, so that we can engage in playful and creative learning. In the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of no technology, limited technology. We were talking about technology literacy earlier today. So we've gotten the tech into the hands of the children. Great. And they're connected to the internet. Great.
Right.
But the various levels of technological literacy that teachers are dealing with, the spectrum is so wide. So really, this is the opportunity to, like you said, it's all blown up. Let's not put it back together. Let's make another masterpiece.
Create something new. Yeah.
Something new.
And I wonder if there's an opportunity now to rebuild communities, because parents are going to need to cooperate within a community. If the kids are home 2 days a week and in school 2 days, the parents are going to need to share Can you put a little community together that we say, okay, you're all being safe, we're being safe. Let's get the kids together so that the remote days, they're moving from one family house to another. I'm also a little Pollyanna about the fact that there are going to be things coming out of this that we'll celebrate. We'll say, we were pushed to do this, and I never would have done it. And now I'm really happy to have it as part of my educational experience or community or whatever it turns out to be.
I love that.
Ellie,
I
I
hope this
agree
does
with you.
push us to community and recognizing, I mean, humanity, if you look throughout history and civilizations, community is huge. And our current lifestyles and our dependence on tech have kind of separated us from the importance of community. So yes, we live in our little bubble, we do our thing, we operate. But maybe this is an opportunity where it's all blown up now and we can utilize the power of community to come up with some solutions for this really challenging situation when it comes to the education of our children. Oof.
Yeah, I think the bonus is that learning will become more relevant, that it really will be. We've been talking about 21st century learning for many years now, you
A
know,
couple of centuries, it feels like.
but this kind of forced us into that. But we do have to do that with the eye on equity, as we talked about earlier. We can't escape that. We have to
Well,
do it.
education is the great equalizer, isn't it? I mean, that's how to move from one level of our culture to another, and there's no, I mean, no one can take away the degree. Once you have it, you have it. Well, there have been times I've thought perhaps they're going to take mine away based on a couple of things I've done. But making sure that it's accessible to everyone. And I do look at it from the rural point of view. Like, we did not have access. And still, my niece and nephew who live on that farm are 15 and 11. And they don't have internet connection. And they are a little removed from the day-to-day community as a result of it. Their friends are all online.
Mhm.
Leah, did they have to deal with a remote learning situation then, where
Yes.
they are? Yeah.
Yeah. And it was, you know, papers to fill out and send back to school.
That's where the reimagining comes in.
Exactly.
As educators, we need to reimagine how we deliver support and guide students. Students, reimagine what school is, what that looks like, and how they can learn. And parents, I'm one included, reimagine what my role is in the education of my student. You know, my kids. It's not just, you know, to pack the lunch and send them on their way. Maybe my role is changing a little bit. And that could be a good thing.
I think so. And I think now that we have parents paying attention, let's gauge them. Let's make sure they stay.
Yeah.
And making it enjoyable, what we've been trying to do with professional development, make it enjoyable for the teacher and the student. Now we're talking about that teacher being the parent and the student.
Ah,
So much to think about.
but I'm so glad that we have this forum and this space to think
Yes.
out loud and learn out loud. Because we're kind of doing both. We're thinking out loud and we're learning from each other out loud because this is all new.
And we're all parents at different stages of the process. And I'm now looking at through the eyes of grandchildren. But part of it is that children are resilient if they have a lot of love and encouragement in their world. So the details of what we're figuring out here, that's what's next. But now we're going to say goodbye. And thank you so much for being part of this conversation with us.
Well, that went by so quick. I can't believe it.
It did.
Thank you so much to Anne and Dr. Marcella Klein-Williams for joining us again. And for all of you guys out there that joined the conversation online, we're so happy to have you. That's it for today. We hope to see you next time. Thank you for joining Teachers for Teachers. That's you moms and dads. I'm Dr. Dejana and I'm here with Dr. Leah and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sounded fine.